Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll try to be slightly more optimistic. I'd like to talk to you today about bioenergy and how we might deploy bioenergy in a multifunctional landscape. And I could have entitled my talk Getting More from Less, and it speaks very much to what Tim was saying about intensification. He talked very succinctly about the food crisis which is upon us, and of course we also have an energy crisis. Estimates vary, but our demand for energy out to 2050 and beyond is likely to rise between 50 and 70%. And so as well as trying to get more food from the environment, we want to get more energy. Why do we need to use land for food at all? We've heard we have this food crisis, it's pressing, and there's a limited resource on which to grow food. But several recent reports have suggested that we do actually need to try to get more from less and to address this energy crisis using bioenergy as part of the solution. For example, many of you may not know, but we do have a UK bioenergy strategy, which was a cross-government strategy that was developed. IPCC reported recently, they had a special report on renewable energy sources and how we can use these to address this energy crisis. There's been something called a Technology Innovation Review, which looked at innovations and industrial exploitation which can be possible to develop bioenergy for the UK. And all of these things, as well as the Committee for Climate Change on bioenergy, they all suggest that bioenergy could be part of the solution to address the energy crisis. I'm going to talk today mostly about the UK, although we shouldn't forget that this is in a global context. But these reports all suggest that at least 10% of primary energy over the coming decades could be met by bioenergy. So it's one of a basket of renewables which could contribute to reducing our carbon footprint. And indeed for the UK, the use of bioenergy for heat and power has been defined as one of the most efficient mechanisms to decarbonise the energy landscape. So that's using bio for heat and power. And of course, liquid fuels are very hard to replace in terms of renewables. And liquid fuel can be met by biological resources, at least in the medium term. It's hard to imagine any renewable sources for aviation fuel other than biofuel. And so there's this concept that at least 10% of primary energy could come from bio, and the UK is working along these 4 pillars of sustainability, or these 4 principles. The top one and most important is that we have to have greenhouse gas savings which are genuine. The reason we're interested in renewables is to reduce our carbon footprint, and so if we don't attack greenhouse gas balance, it's hardly worth investing in these new technologies. They have to be cost-effective contributions to our UK emissions reduction. So Tim's already said that about a quarter of the global emissions of carbon dioxide come from agriculture. It's slightly less in the UK, but nevertheless it's substantial. And we have to maximise these benefits, minimise costs, and the global risks should be minimised. And this policy has led to some perverse outcomes. For example, we have the largest coal-burning power station in the UK, Drax, is now requiring 7 million tonnes of biomass in the near future to combust, to generate electricity for all of us, because that is what the analysis is telling us. But the perverse consequence of that is that we're now importing several million tonnes of timber from northern USA, and the environmental footprint of that may be questionable. And so within the UK, we need to look to see how we can use the landscape more effectively to generate some of that renewable supply. It won't be vast, it won't address all of the demand, but it can address some of it. And of course, in Interdisciplinary Week, this is an absolute interdisciplinary problem. How we use land for energy, how we transition some lands which might be used for other purposes at the moment into bioenergy cropping, or how we can use the land more effectively for food alongside energy. As I said, the top question is this technology really low carbon? That's incredibly important. So you have here a little utopian figure from Department of Energy in the USA about how we're evolving into a bioeconomy. We've had the oil economy, and in future biological resources will enter the biorefineries, and we have this concept that we'll utilize every part of the green plant. We may use the grain for food, we may use the biomass in the biorefinery, we could generate liquid fuel, we will produce a range of chemicals. Is that going to happen? Is it possible? We've also heard about unsustainable use, the use of land for energy, and can we identify these lands which aren't suitable for food, or can we have severe consequences for species that are unforeseen? We've heard a little bit about palm oil and ecosystem services, and we have to be able to protect ecosystem services, and we see mass destruction of some tropical rainforests in favour of palm oil. And of course biofuel is only a tiny fragment of that issue. There's a larger political landscape at work there which we've already heard about. Should we displace food crops elsewhere on the globe? So if we take a piece of land in the UK, we use it for biofuel cropping, the food that might have generated is then displaced elsewhere. These are the so-called indirect land use change impacts. I'm going to largely talk about a system-bound UK today, so I won't touch on that, but I'm very happy to talk about it later. And so this has led to a complex environment where we're trying to develop these sustainability criteria which will allow bioenergy to be taken forward to make that 10% supply. So to distill all of that down, how can we think about bioenergy in terms of sustainability? Well, we can think about three guiding principles. I won't bore you with EU directives because it gets rather complicated and we're in a stalemate in Europe at the moment. But bioenergy crops need to be intensified. Just as we heard for food crops, yield and resource use, we have to intensify them and get more from the amount of land that we already have. Avoid conflicts with food. They have to have a better greenhouse gas balance, and we have to protect ecosystem services. So those are the guiding principles to which we're working at the moment. How do we get from the oil to the bio-oil economy? How are we going to make it? Well, this is the bad old days of what we call the first generation biofuel crops. So this is where we took food crops, which it's a classic example of policy riding ahead of science and evidence, where the EU mandated that we had to put a certain amount of liquid biofuel into our gas tanks, and the easiest way to get sugars and ferment them was from food crops. And it's largely predicted that this first generation use of food crops is an over-mature industry, and it won't grow much. And the way policy is developing, it will actually stagnate into the future. And the big expansion at the moment is in these things called lignocellulosic resources and residues. So lignocellulosics might be some of these wastes that Tim alluded to. They're the bits of the plant which are left over when we've taken the food products that we want. And this is where we might be now. We're developing technologies to utilise these wastes into power generation. So even municipal waste is being turned into energy, and lots of agricultural waste. And then these lignocellulosic crops, these are non-food crops, sometimes called second generation crops, where we're just using the biomass resource to generate energy. And there's this wonderful world over here where by 2030 we might be actually using algal resources to develop liquid fuels. I'm not quite sure that's going to happen. We'll wait to see. It hasn't been particularly energy efficient to date. And then beyond that, of course, there'll be electrification and there might be hydrogen. So that's where we're going at the moment. So what do non-food energy crops look like? Well, they might look like this. This is a fast-growing poplar tree. It's in the same group of plants as willow, and it's one of these crops which might be a lignocellulosic energy crop. How can we change these crops to make them more suitable for energy? Well, there are lots of things we need to do, but particularly yield intensification, as we've mentioned. Lots of inputs we need to reduce, but greenhouse gas emissions, they have to have good greenhouse gas balance. And these are the things that are ongoing in science at the moment to make these crops relevant to bioenergy use today. And agricultural systems have been breeding for several thousand years, and these bioenergy crops are just in their first or second generation of breeding and improvement. So a little bit of research then. What about the greenhouse gas balance and carbon footprint of these new energy systems which we might deploy in the UK? Well, you can think about a bioenergy chain a little bit like this, where you start with the green non-food crops, and they have lots of greenhouse gas emissions. The plants respire, they fix carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, and then the whole chain through transport and energy production has a carbon cost. But if you look at this chain in detail, this is the bit that we know relatively little about. We can put costs on these other parts of the chain, but it's here, it's the biological system that we know we have a gap in our knowledge. And so we currently have a project at Southampton, which is called the Energy Land Use and Modelling Field Trial, which has been sponsored by all of these organisations, brought together under the umbrella of the ETI, the Energy Technology Institute, to try to address some of these issues. The Elem project is being run by several partners across the UK, and it has an aim which is to quantify how land use transitions to bioenergy impact on greenhouse gas balance. We want to develop modelling tools which can then be deployed at geographic locations, so they can be resolved spatially across the UK, so we can make predictions on sustainability and inform government policy. So what does the land use transition look like in the UK? We can think about here three major classes of land use in the UK: arable, managed grass and forest, and how they might transition to short rotation coppice, a type of energy crop; perennial grass, a large grass, another type of energy crop, usually miscanthus in the UK; first generation food crops, fast growing forestry, or second generation crops. And anywhere on this figure you see a green block, that means that there's a largely positive impact on soil organic carbon, total soil carbon and greenhouse gas balance. Anywhere you see a red bar, it means there's potentially a largely negative impact. Blue is neutral, but the most worrying thing here is that the black represents a lack of knowledge, that we really don't have the numbers in there. Now, given that we've been developing policies on how much bioenergy we should deploy, that's rather worrying that we don't have the evidence base for these particular crops. And so we're engaged in looking at some of these transitions. I'm going to show one example today for this transition from a grassland to a coppice energy crop of willow in Sussex. So significant gaps exist, and we need to understand these gaps to get at this very important thing, which is the greenhouse gas balance or carbon footprint. In the UK, we're in pretty good shape. We've set up a network of sites where we're looking at a number of transitions from Scotland down to Sussex. And you can see, for example, forest research is looking at grass to short rotation forestry. That's where we grow trees as single stems. In Lincolnshire, we have arable to willow or arable to miscanthus. And down here in Sussex, we're looking at grass to willow. And we have some work in Aberystwyth too. What do we do at these networks? Well, we want to understand this carbon cycling and greenhouse gas balance. So we know that these plants take up carbon in the process of photosynthesis, they release carbon, they store carbon, some of it goes to the roots, some of it goes into microbes, some of it goes into the soil, and the system also emits greenhouse gases, N2O, methane and carbon dioxide from the soil, and we want to quantify all of these so we can deploy some heavy-duty kit to do exactly that. So we can deploy what we call eddy covariance that looks at packets of air across the system and measures carbon dioxide. We can look at the other greenhouse gases. We can do measurements of the standing carbon. We can look at the dynamics of soil respiration and capture that in real time. And then we're also interested in this potential biomitigation strategy, which is to add a relatively inert byproduct from pyrolysis back into the soil to lock up carbon in the long term. So we're looking at the impact of that and how this affects soil microbes. So these empirical data are what we need to feed into our models to come up with predictions for the UK. If we do that, what do we find? Well, this is the carbon balance of a bioenergy transition 5 years after conversion in Sussex. Anything going down below this line means there's a drawdown of carbon into the system. So gross primary productivity, there's a net drawdown. And anything above the line is a net release. So it's a slightly interesting way that flux people look at their carbon data. And we've got here tons of carbon. All of our greenhouse gases are converted to carbon equivalents, and we look at per hectare, and you can see the grass and the willow. So the willow, perhaps not surprisingly, this bioenergy crop pulls down more carbon in the system. It respires. This is total respiration. This is soil respiration. It requires a little bit less. And if you try and look at the balance of that, this is the net balance. What we see is that there's a net uptake of carbon into the willow crop of about 2 tonnes per hectare per year relative to the grass. So in our world where we're deploying bioenergy crops and we're doing this particular transition, there's actually an improvement in the carbon balance of the system. And we can discuss why that might be, but there are various reasons for that. So this is a relatively positive message. Another way of saying that is that the willow is a net sink for carbon, the grass is a net source. And if you want to look at that in real time, the flux tower measures carbon balance 20 times a second, and this is the fingerprint plot for carbon uptake. And you can see in the summer, willow has a very intensive uptake of carbon dioxide in the process of photosynthesis. Now this is heartening, because in 2009 we did some non-validated modelling with Pete Smith and looked at the greenhouse gas balance of various land use transitions in the UK, and we came up with a set of rules of what we should do in the UK and what we shouldn't do. The first was that we should never replace woodland with any bioenergy crop. We shouldn't replace grassland with oilseed rape, that first generation crop. SRC and miscanthus are broadly okay for arable replacement. SRC and miscanthus are okay, they're good replacement on grassland. We have a net carbon benefit. And oilseed rape on arable is neutral. So, and we've concluded from our empirical measurements that this is in fact the case, that our models are now validated and we can move forward with them. So greenhouse gas, what about yield intensification? Well, yield gaps, very important in these bioenergy crops. Lots of data here on reports, such that we know that if we do an energy balance on these things, that the potential yield that we might get up to is in excess of 30 tonnes per hectare per year. Whereas what we see actually, if you go to a field, a commercial field in the UK, farmers are very lucky to get 10 tonnes per hectare per year. So we need to address this yield gap in some way. This yield gap occurs because we don't grow these plants in perfect conditions, they're subject to pests and pathogens, and we don't have the perfect genetic material matched to every single environment. So we have to intensify this yield to get more from less. What do we need to do that? Well, one thing that is ongoing at the moment at Southampton, again, it's another interdisciplinary project. We've worked with the Software Sustainability Institute. We run a model for every 1 kilometre squared of the UK, which predicts yields of a particular bioenergy crop. This is for short rotation coppice. So it's short rotation coppice yield. And there are about 300,000 cells in the UK that we can run. And this used to take us many hours to run this model, and we've now just ported it to the Iridis 4 supercomputer at Southampton, and we can run our model very, very quickly. And we get these yield maps, so we can see that we get more yield in some areas of the country relative to others. The darker areas, the red areas, are generally lower yields, and over here we see some of the higher yields moving towards the west. And we've been working on these models now of yield to understand yield and how it might change with climate. We've used the UK climate change predictions out to from 2010 to 2050. So you can see that our crops increase, our bioenergy crops are going to increase with predicted climate changes. That ties into what something Tim was saying for the UK. But the increases are rather moderate. We might move from 10 to 12 tonnes per hectare per year. But what this coloured map shows is the highest yielding type of bioenergy crop. And you can see that there's a huge amount of red on this map. And those red squares are where we're growing short rotation forestry. And we can see that it tends to beat some of our more traditional bioenergy crops, such as coppice and miscanthus. So these are the sorts of technical potential maps that we're developing. You can see here that this map's being constrained, i.e. these black areas are excluded. They're the high carbon soils for the UK, which wouldn't be suitable for bioenergy planting. So we see that SRF is very suitable in the future, going forward for high yield. Our yield increases are modest, and in fact, I haven't spoken in detail, but actually willow declines in yield. And we can find some target areas for UK bioenergy crops. What about the other ecosystem services that these systems deliver? This is some work by Susie Milner and Rob Holland, where we're trying to put metrics on how these transitions from arable, grass and forestry impact a whole basket of things that these ecosystems deliver. Well, we're focusing here on provisioning and regulating services. And we can see that green are largely positive, blue largely neutral, and red largely negative. But the paleness of some of those numbers tells us that we have very little confidence in some of the data, because again, we have gaps in our understanding. If we try to look at some of those matrices, poor figure here, but we can see again that it addresses this idea of getting more from less, that we begin to identify areas of the UK, this is for miscanthus and this is for willow, where the benefits for ecosystem services will be greater than other parts of the UK. And these maps are particularly constrained by agricultural land class. So we exclude all the grade 1 and 2 agricultural land and some of the grade 3, which would be required for food. So it's one way that we're thinking about this landscape and getting more from the landscape. And, you know, we need to start thinking a little bit more widely about how we could deploy these systems at farm scale. So moving from intensive arable cropping systems through to more environmentally sensitive schemes where we incorporate bioenergy crops into the landscape. And we just published this in an opinion paper which is about to come out. So that's one way that we can undertake our getting more from less and at landscape scale. What about genetic modification? Let's think of the other possibility. How can we use this technology? Is it likely to be valuable? Well, this has obviously been pressing on the mind of our Prime Minister, who asked his chief scientist last year to report on the risks and benefits that GM might offer to the UK, and to particularly think about EU regulation and where we were going with that. And the Council for Science and Technology reported, and one of their conclusions was that when properly controlled, GM products can be as safe as their conventional counterparts. So that report was given to the Prime Minister just at the end of last year. So they offer another route where we might be able to intensify. What about bioenergy? How does that relate to bioenergy? Well, if we want to use lignocellulosics, non-food crops for energy, it's a rather horrid process in that we have to pre-treat our lignocellulosics, we have to hydrolyze the wood, we have to ferment and get glucose out of the wood. There's a lot of carbon there, but we have to release it, we have to ferment it, and we have to make ethanol. And these processes require lots of chemicals, for example, strong acids, enzymes, which are incredibly expensive financially and environmental terms to produce, and then more microbes and enzymes in these systems. And so these are major bottlenecks to making this technology both economically and environmentally robust. So can GM address any of these issues? Well, I wanted to show you one example which was published just a couple of weeks ago in PNAS. It's from Wildtype and co-workers in Ghent. And this is a field of genetically modified poplar. This is another. So you can see the trees, they've been grown for bioethanol production. And these are the wild-type trees, and these are a couple of the GM lines. And what they've done is they've down-regulated some of the lignin biosynthetic pathway. They've actually changed the quality of lignin in the wood. And a side effect of this is that the wood becomes rather red, and you can see this here. They've quantified that to some extent. Another group in France have also made the same trees. This was a project we were working on jointly called Energy Poplar. And they've put these in field trial, one of the few field trials of GM trees at the moment, one in Belgium and one in France. And this is the wild-type tree, and these are the GM trees where lignin has been down-regulated, and this is ethanol production. And you can see that these GM trees produce vastly more amounts of ethanol. In fact, the original construct they did, it was about 40%, 50% up, which is this one. And they've improved that even further, such that in the French field site, this particular line has an increase in ethanol production of over 160% compared to the control. And so I guess we should be asking the question as to whether this technology is environmentally sound and what the risks and benefits are to its deployment. It's useful in that these trees won't go into our food chain at least, and so one of the issues that stops GM development might not be critical here. So what can we conclude then? Well, I hope I've shown you a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the things we're doing at the moment in Southampton and in the UK, that bioenergy offers some potential to provide this low-carbon heat power and also liquid fuels. The greenhouse gas balance of these systems is critical. We need to measure it as we're doing, and but we do have some cause for optimism that some of the balances look quite good. Spatially in the UK, we're beginning to identify those areas where food crops won't be grown and where we might see some of these energy crops emerging, and that GM is providing some other routes to intensification that we should perhaps consider. And finally, I'd just like to finish by thanking all of my co-workers in the laboratory here and across the UK. Thanks.